Hey class, welcome to week 7. Today we're going to talk about evaluation and negotiation, and then our special topics commodities, so let's jump in. When we left the procurement process, we discussed scopes of work, addendum, and finally receiving the proposals. So what happens next, now that you have a stack of proposals on your desk ready to go? The next steps are you have to evaluate the bids, select a vendor or vendors, and negotiate the contract itself. I'll also briefly cover the joys of protests and presenting recommendations to municipal governing boards, because those are always just so much fun. The lecture is in 2 parts today. Part 1 is evaluation and protests, and Part 2 is negotiation, presenting to the governing board, and our special topic of the week, utilities contracting. So don't forget to watch both lectures. They are in 1 PDF, so if you need to see the slides. So 2 lectures, 1 PDF. Let's get started. Before you can even start looking at the proposals you've received, you have to identify your evaluation team. There are a lot of potential evaluation team members, which I've listed here. It's often helpful to have a service area expert, someone that is highly involved in the service itself. Often a department's manager or business manager also wants to be involved so that they are highly aware of the costs that will be associated with the project, and the range of bids that you receive will give them that information. If a department has a contract manager or someone that oversees the conduct of the contractors their department uses, that person definitely needs to be involved as well. Other members of the team would be the finance or budget representative, again, so they can keep an eye on the potential costs or goods of the services, the department's attorney, and then potentially other members of the procurement department. These individuals are more likely to be involved if there's a huge risk or just a lot of spend associated with the contract. So not always, just kind of if it's a special project. Rarely, a jurisdiction may elect to involve the citizens that will be affected by the service, consultants that provide advice on issues related to the service, and or members of the governing boards or other local government officials. You can see why these might not be very popular, though, because they'll each have their a very specific point of view that may be biased and not necessarily in the best interest of the jurisdiction as a whole. So now that you've picked your and who you invite to your team on the who you invite to be on the evaluation team will vary a lot based on several factors. First, the type of project you're working on. If the solicitation was for a highly technical piece of software, you may need several service area experts to help assess the proposals, because chances are you don't know which type of system is going to work best for the city. Often we have to involve our network security manager for the city and to make sure that a company's software solution isn't going to compromise our system. Even for less technical services, it is still good to have those employees that will be working with the contractor on a daily basis involved in the decision making, but you may or may not need that many. The second factor is how your procurement department is set up. I believe the LaRue book discusses centralized versus decentralized procurement structures in an earlier chapter, but basically centralized procurement means there is one procurement department that serves all divisions of the city, regardless of whether the things that you're buying are goods, services, technology, or construction, or something specific to a specific department. A decentralized procurement structure is when several or all departments have their own procurement professionals which conduct solicitations. The risk to the jurisdiction must also be taken into consideration when you're trying to figure out who to put on your team. Now, don't get me wrong, all projects we do are important, or we wouldn't be spending money on them in the first place. It's just that some projects have a lot more risk than others. For example, selecting one engine repair mechanic over another isn't that risky, as long as both companies have the certifications and training needed and you can verify that they have those. Then consider security guard services for the municipality's buildings, like actual security guards. The company is responsible for the safety of the employees and capital assets like vehicles and technology. For that type of project, you may need evaluation team members like attorneys and higher city officials to carefully consider the experience and reputation of each company that submits a proposal. Finally, you need to consider whether the project is for an internal customer or an external customer. What I mean by that is whether the services will serve citizens or will it serve the town employees. An external service would be something like residential recycling collection. For that type of project, citizens may have a lot of opinions about what type of company is chosen because the company selected will affect their everyday lives. For something like software package, the city needs to run like a database. Citizens really don't care. They're not going to get involved in that kind of decision making. All this is to say that you have to carefully consider who best to have in the room assessing each proposal. In general, though, I think about 3 to 7 evaluation team members is a good number of people, not too big that you can't easily schedule a meeting, and not too small that you don't cover all points of view. So regardless of who is selected to be on your evaluation team, it's important to remember that their performance and decision-making reflect directly on the organization. If they pick the most expensive vendor, that tells the public that the jurisdiction has money to burn unless they can really back up their opinion. If they choose a minority-owned business, it shows the community that the jurisdiction is committed to working with underutilized businesses. Most important, perhaps, is that there can be no appearance of any evaluation team members having a conflict of interest. If it looks bad, it is bad for the government. I don't care if one of my team members' wives used to be a secretary at a company that was 10 years ago. I still want to know and individually assess each instance, or even the possibility of conflict of interest. Another thing to keep in mind is that most local governments won't allow their employees to be co-employed, meaning that if a firefighter has a lawn care business on the side, the local government couldn't award a contract to that lawn care business because then the firefighter would be benefiting in 2 ways, and the public could claim that they only got the contract because the firefighter knew someone at the jurisdiction. So it's just not fair. Once you've identified and brought together your evaluation team with proposals in front of them, their first task is to assess whether a company is responsive and/or responsible, which we'll discuss in detail in the next couple slides. The next item is usually cost. As much as we like to say that cost and pricing doesn't matter for service projects, cost is of course very important in making a decision among service providers. If 3 companies provide pretty much the same service and all have decent reputations and experience, the government is going to go with the lowest cost option because it's our job to get a good deal for taxpayers. Once the team has narrowed down the list of responding vendors to those that the department can afford and they believe can perform the work, they can then conduct site visits or interview the department's customers in person, or the vendors in person. These can be really helpful in determining which vendor has the best vehicles, facility, experience, and approach to the work. We also often contact vendors' references to make sure that all the promises they make in their proposals have been done before. We're not the first person that they've tried something for. Sure, if they list a reference in their proposal, most likely that reference is going to be positive, but I've called references that were lukewarm on a vendor, and sometimes vendors can't come up with more than a couple of references, which is also a red flag. Of course, the most important thing the evaluation team is responsible for is actually selecting a vendor or vendors that provide the best service at the best price for the city. Next. All right, so what does responsiveness mean? In short, it means that the vendor complied with all the components and requirements of the RFP. Often, the procurement officer checks each proposal when they are first opened to make the process smoother, so by the time the team actually sits down to discuss the proposals, only responsive bidders are being considered. If a service provider's proposal is rejected based on being non-responsive, it usually means they didn't include a particular form, didn't follow the instructions, or didn't accurately or completely describe how they would provide the services. I gave a lot of leeway here because some services, like repairing an engine, just don't take that long to describe. But if all a company submits as a proposed solution is, yeah, we fix engines, that's just not sufficient. Most often, I'd say we reject proposals if they don't include a response to the scope of work, or if their pricing or other key forms are missing. And I know this sounds harsh, but think about it. If a vendor can't follow these simple instructions on how to compile their proposal, how are they really going to be as a partner to the jurisdiction? Do you really want a nursing company that can't complete a proposal accurately, in charge of serving children in their homes and completing all the paperwork that goes with that? Yeah, probably not. All right, responsibility of a vendor refers to whether they can actually do the work. You're trying to decide whether they have the capacity, skill, and resources to actually get the work done. This is much more difficult than determining whether they're responsive, because you have to read between the lines of what they present. A company may say they comply with all the requirements in the scope, but it's up to the evaluation team to determine whether their response indicates a strong understanding of what needs to be done. I've seen some really fancy proposals submitted and beautiful binders with embossed cover letters that just fell flat when you actually start reading the content, because it's clear the company just doesn't know what they're doing. Overall, it's important that a vendor is both responsive in that they follow the instructions and responsible in that they can actually perform the work. All right, so remember that you're all hypothetical procurement officers this semester, and as such, you would have a lot of responsibilities during the process. The evaluation phase of a project is really where you have to put on your mediator hat, your secretary hat, your referee hat, and your teacher hat. You have to document the decisions and thoughts of the group for the official record, like the evaluation notes I've included for this week, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you're also in charge of guiding the conversation, making sure the stakeholders consider all the vendors have to offer, and often debriefing the vendors after the process is over and what they could have done better. You also have to respond to protests, but we'll get into that in a minute as well. Really, this can be really the hardest part of a procurement process, because often the stakeholders either just want the vendor they've been using if they're doing a good job, or are generally negative towards all the vendors because they think they're all crooks. Now, some vendors are crooks, but you have to at least respect each company that took the time to compile a proposal by carefully considering their offer. You're also responsible for responding to any public information requests, or what we call FOIA requests, because all our documents are available per the Freedom of Information Act. This means that all your notes are public record and can be requested at any time by vendors, the media, or other agencies. So here are some examples of things you might be looking for in a firm's proposal, but really there are hundreds of things that may or may not be important to the jurisdiction depending on the service being solicited. To help illustrate this, I've attached in Moodle some examples of evaluation sheets from recent projects I've done. Feel free to pause this now and bring those examples up because I'm going to tell you a little about each of them. Okay. The first one is from the multifamily garbage recycling and bulky item collection contract. This vendor was the city's top pick, though they weren't actually awarded, but that's a whole other story. You can see that we got into a lot of detail on this one because of the high spend of the contract, which would have been about $14 million over 5 years, and the huge capital outlay required by the vendor. You'll see that we noted a lot of strengths, like they have been serving the city for many years and are very adamant about recycling, but also that they're lacking in other areas like modernizing their fleet with compressed natural gas vehicles. More generally, we list when they were founded and what type of references they have. The second page is from the county's voluntary benefit services, such as flexible spending, accounts, and accident benefits. This vendor was not chosen by my evaluation team, and you can see our concerns in that second to bottom box regarding their pricing and how they wanted to run open enrollment. Note that we didn't just say, they were too expensive, what are we, made of money? But kept it much more civil by saying their rates were the least competitive in such and such categories. This is important because vendors will request these forms, and if you appear to be inflammatory about the company, that can spark a protest. The last page is one vendor of 3 that we awarded contracts to for our Neighborhood and Business Services Department's legal services. I included this one because we did a multiple award, but also the evaluation of this project was more about the reputation and capability of specific employees at the law firms that responded. You'll see under company and or proposal background that it was important to note how many attorneys and paralegals as well as how long they've been a firm. It was also just nice that even though this was a law firm, they didn't have any contract exceptions. So I hope these are helpful in illustrating what we're looking for in proposals. Clearly these are just a couple examples, and I have tons more if you guys are interested in looking at those. All right, finally, another role of the procurement officer is hopefully preventing a protest, but if one arises, then you have to deal with it. A protest is when a vendor lodges a formal complaint against a municipality concerning the procurement process, and this often occurs when the vendor doesn't think they were treated fairly, but not necessarily just when they don't get any work. We've had vendors protest when they wanted more work and didn't get all the work. Local governments are often less structured in how they respond to protests, but if you're using federal funds for a project, there may be a very specific guideline for that. All that being said, you often make a huge deal and jump through a million hoops to prove that the evaluation team did everything right, and 99% of protests really come to nothing. The moral of the story is do everything right up front. So this is the end of the first lecture, so make sure to find the second part in YouTube.